We'll give it about another minute. I guess that minute is now. I'll get started. I want to say thanks for everyone to coming out to my talk when Macs come under attack. It's a pleasure to be here at DerbyCon. This is my first DerbyCon. It's been an awesome con so far. The community is amazing. I'm glad I'm able to talk about something that I enjoy, which is macOS detection and response. So let's jump right into it. My name is Richie Cyrus. I'm currently adversary detection analyst at Spectre Ops. I'm an Apple fanboy, and sadly, I'm a New York Knicks fan. We've been horrible for quite some time. So prior to Spectre Ops, I cut a lot of my teeth in the private and public sector. Most recently at Apple, I was on the incident response and monitoring team. So a lot of what this talk consists of came from my time at Apple and what I wasn't able to share. But now that I've left Apple, I'm able to share some of this information that might help you in your enterprise when you go about hunting for macOS malicious activity. And so a little bit about the outline of this talk. So I'll go into like the need for macOS threat hunting and then what the macOS attack landscape looks like today. Also the hunt methodology. So a lot of people bring up threat hunting, but they don't know what it is, or they might have some skewed view of how to go about doing it. So I'll introduce the hunt methodology that we subscribe to at Spectre Ops, and then some of the tools and data that you'll need to hunt. And then we'll go into adversary techniques and detections of these techniques that I'll introduce. And then a cool little demo where I'll introduce like what an attack looks like on the offensive side, and then switching over to the defensive side and looking at that activity and picking one technique and hunting for that activity. So there was a series of commercials back in 2007 in which you have the Mac versus the PC. The guy in the suit is the PC user, and the guy with the cool hoodie is the Mac user. And right now in this commercial, he's like taking care of the sick guy because he's come down with a virus. And the PC guy is like, yeah, there's a bunch of these viruses going around. There's over 100,000 of these viruses. And the Mac guy was like, oh, poor thing. Sorry for you. Macs don't get those. Well, that is false. Even back in 2000, even back as far as 2006, you had the leap worm, which was pretty significant in all macOS systems. And so even back then, it wasn't maybe as prevalent as Windows viruses and malware that was going around, but Macs did in fact have viruses. And so a lot of the marketing that Apple had back then and even today is like, okay, the nomenclature that Macs don't get viruses. Well, that's simply untrue. And so in order for us to hunt for malicious activity, you have to come to terms that, hey, there are malicious activity going on Macs. Like Macs are getting hit with malware, right? And so that takes us to today. Well, what I mentioned, Macs are getting attacked. And so a lot of what kind of, pushed this upward thread was that as you get more Macs in the homes of users, as you get more Macs in the enterprise environment, you think of your enterprise environment, your security team wants a Mac, your developers want a Mac to do their work, your higher-ups want a Mac because they think they're cool and they want the Mac, right? And so these are the folks with the most to lose. And so attackers know this, and as that market share goes up, they're going to become more interested in writing malware for Mac OS. And so to piggyback on that, there are also APT groups that are now interested in Mac OS. You have X-Agent that was used by APT28, also known as the Fancy Bear folks. And then you have Ocean Lotus, which was tied to APT32. And so it's no longer that game where there's Mac malware being written out there to just do stuff like adware or to get some monetary gain. There are actual nation states interested in Mac OS systems and doing them harm. So you also have vulnerabilities that occur on Mac OS systems that leave them susceptible to major attack. I don't know if many people are familiar with the I am root vulnerability, where you put in root as the username and you hit password a few times. This was back in last year, 2017. And if you press that enough times, you would get root on the system, right? And you have elevated privileges to do some nasty things. So kudos to Apple for cleaning it up pretty quickly, but in that window of time, the landscape was wide open for attack. And so I'll talk about what the Mac attack landscape looks like today. So A lot of the MAC attacks that you see, well, one, you see macros there, right? Because if there's macros that are there to exist, they will be weaponized to distribute malicious activity. Also PDF documents, right? So that's one way, getting that in email. But then a more interesting way that you don't see too much on the Windows side, but you're starting to see it on the Mac side, is like supply chain compromises. So the tool Handbrake that's used for video encoding, the mirror to download that tool was compromised. And so what the attackers did was they embedded some malicious code into Handbrake, and then they added that to the download mirror. And so when you go to download Handbrake, you think you're getting a true copy, but it's backdoored with some additional malicious code that will persist on your system. The same thing happened with transmission that actually distributed Mac OS ransomware. So that was the first time we saw Mac OS ransomware in the wild, is that supply chain compromise. And then, I mean, if any of you had a Mac or you have families that have a Mac, you've come across an ad where it says download Adobe Flash. That's almost never Adobe Flash. And so that's how users get compromised as well. And so threat hunting, right? What is threat hunting? How do we do it? Well, at Spectre Ops, we like to subscribe to the methodology that threat hunting is actively searching for malicious activity that has evaded the defenses that you have in place, right? So your EDR tools, things that you have monitoring your network, your firewall, whatever you have in place defensively, you're assuming that the attacker has knowledge of it or has been able to bypass that. And so you're looking for malicious activity in spite of those defenses being in place, right? And so why we hunt is here. So Michael Hayden, which was the former director of NSA and CIA, he says, fundamentally, if someone wants to get in, they're going to get in. You're in the fight, acknowledge that, own up to it, and you're most certainly penetrated, right? And so that's a lot of the assumed breach mentality. And so if you take the assumed breach mentality, as Matt Graber eloquently stated here, then you kind of introduce the attacker's dilemma into the equation, right? So the attacker dilemma, for so long, me as a blue teamer, I've hated this for so long, where an attacker will say, oh, you know, the defense has to get it right so many times. There's so many holes that they have to fill. If I get into this, you know, one system, then it's game over, right? Well, if you assume that you're breached, then you start to flip that on their head, right? The attacker has to do so many things right not to get caught once, because once they get caught once, it kicks off the IR process, and you have evidence of someone being in their environment. So your security awareness is heightened, right? And so we go into now, how can we detect attackers' behaviors and activity post-compromise, right? That's the big piece that if you could do this well, it'll take care of a lot of the things in your environment as far as post-compromise. And so it'll be nice if we had a framework that can display to us all the behaviors and activities that attackers could do post-compromise. Well, that's where MITRE ATT&CK comes in, right? And so MITRE ATT&CK is a framework for describing the behaviors of cyber adversaries across the intrusion lifecycle, but the majority of the framework is focused on post-compromise activity, which is ripe for threat hunting, right? And so it's pretty convenient to answer our question. And documented in the frameworks are the tactics that are being used by the attackers. So that's like high level. And then the techniques that are being used. So the specific thing that they use to accomplish the tactic. And then the procedures goes into, well, you know, the specific actions that they took to carry out their technique. And so MITRE ATT&CK includes Mac, Windows, and Linux, but we'll be primarily talking about Mac. And so we can use this framework for hunting. It's ideal. What we'll do is in the hunt methodology, we'll identify the tactic and the technique that we want to hunt for. And that's, you know, guided by your upper management. That's guided by your threat intel team saying, okay, well, maybe you're in the financial sector. These are the types of attacks that you might come across. And so with that, you say, okay, well, what are the techniques that we might come across? And let's hunt for those techniques so that we're ahead of the curve, right? And so once you identify the tactic and the technique, then you go about identifying the procedure, right? How specifically are they carrying out that technique, right? There's multiple ways to like add a user to the system using like net, right? And so after that, you want to identify the collection requirements, which I'll get into, which evolves around like data and collection of data. And then you want to identify the scope, right? So do you want to focus on just like the enterprise systems in totality, or do you want to focus on maybe the systems that the executive staffs have, maybe the security team's systems, or maybe the developer systems, right, in the case of Mac? And how long do you want that scope to run for? Do you want to hunt for a week? Do you want to hunt for a couple months? What does that look like, right? And so what we subscribe to is that folks should hunt for a specific technique and tactic for about a week's time, right? And then from that, document what you have so far and let the results from that documentation lead into the next hunt and keep moving along. You don't want to be stuck in like a paralysis cycle where you're worried about finishing a specific hunt to the point where it never gets completed, and that's all you worry about. And so if you adapt this hunt methodology, you start to create a minefield, right? And so this is what I talked about before, where you kind of guide the attacker to where they need to be, right, on your system to do a compromise. And so if, let's say, you knock out everything in execution, right, or most things in executions, then there's only a limited set of execution techniques that they could carry out in order to carry out their entire attack. And so if they trip over any of these detections or analytics, it kicks off the IR process, and you're able to respond to it a little bit faster. And so when you're hunting, and the more times you go through this iterative process, then you're able to take a technique, take a tactic, and dive into the details. And then the next time that an attacker or your red team comes across that, you'll be better equipped, right? And so in order to create this minefield, you need to have the data to represent that, right? And so the cool thing about MITRE ATTACK, it has the data sources section, in which it tells you what data source you need to actually make the detection come to life, right? And so I used the API that MITRE has to extract these details from the data sources, specifically for macOS. And so for process monitoring, file monitoring, process command line, and process use of network, those were the highest, right? So from those 4 items, if I were to build detections off of those, if I collected that type of data, it'll give me the best chance to start to create that minefield and knock out as many techniques as possible. And so I'll go into some of the tools that you can use to do this, and all of these tools are open source. And so you could go home today, try this in your lab environment, deploy this in your network, and get some use out of it. It's free to use it. The first tool I introduced is Google Santa. So this was a tool that was developed by Google's Macintosh operations team for the purpose of binary whitelisting or blacklisting. But the thing that's cool about this is it also gives you process monitoring, right? So that gives us one of the data sources that I described just now. A lesser known tool is XNewMon. It was written by Daniel Roethlisberger. And so it's designed to mimic Sysmon. Who's familiar with Sysmon for Windows? And so the idea behind this is that it's going to be Sysmon for Mac, right? So it has various event IDs. One event ID is basically monitoring for the agent. This XNewMon is persisting via a launch agent. So it's monitoring for the agent. If anything happens to the agent, it'll log, it'll give you that event ID. Also, if there's anything going on as far as like process command, like process injection, you typically have to call task for PID, right? And so that's like another event type that's there. It also does process monitoring, which is another event type. And it logs persistent items, which like launchd, launch agents, launch daemons, which I'll get into, and that's a separate event type. So anytime that you have a process execute on a Mac, the cool thing about XNewMon that separates it from the rest of the group that does process monitoring is that it'll show you the process, it'll show you the hash of that process, but it has a cool feature called ancestors, which will show you not only the parent process for that process that just executed, but all the way down through the tree to the process that kicked that whole thing off. So for Macs, that process is launchd. That's similar to like init for Linux. And so it'll show you that ancestry from the process that just executed all the way down to launchd, which is pretty cool. And last but not least, OS Query. So if you do Mac defense, a lot of people are familiar with OS Query. And so what OS Query is best at doing is tracking persistent items, right? Because one, OS Query has some scheduled queries that you run across your enterprise in an SQL format, right? So all of the data that OS Query collects is sort of thrown into a database, and then you can interact with that database with various tables that you have access to. And so the cool thing about OS Query, it does file integrity monitoring pretty well as far as Yara scanning and process monitoring. The process monitoring for OS Query piggybacks off of Audit D, which is a little bit kludgy if you ever work with that in an enterprise environment. But for the process monitoring piece, you would probably want to go with Santa or XNUMON. So I'll get into techniques that are used by attackers now. Well, the three most popular tactics that are used by attackers. So the first is persistence, right? And so the idea behind persistence is like the attacker has compromised the system, right? They've either fished their way in or found some other mechanism, but they don't want to lose that access to their system, right? It's a pain. Speaking to the red teamers on my team and red teamers throughout the community, red teamers hate phishing. It is a chore. So they want to make sure that they maintain persistence just so they don't have to phish anybody else again, right? And so the most common way to do that on a Mac OS system is through launch agents and launch daemons. So the idea behind launch agents and launch daemons is launch D kicks off the process. So that's the first process after the bootloader kicks off, and it's the first user land process that exists, right? And the existence of launch D is to kick off and load everything that's in the system library launch daemons folder, and then everything in the library launch daemons folder. And what that is, those are like system level functions that will happen. They're like more like services. And so when a user logs into the system, then the specific launch agents and system library and the user's individual library folder will execute, right? Or be kicked off or load into the system. And so if you've never seen a launch agent or a launch daemon before, here it is right here. And the key behind it, the major key behind the launch agent or the launch daemon is the run at load, right? So if run at load is set to 0, then it'll be on the box, but when it's loaded by the system, it just won't execute the command that's in the program arguments, right? So with every launch agent and every launch daemon, there is a associated binary with that launch agent or launch daemon, and that's what actually executes at load, right? And so attackers have been making use of this for quite some time. The first image at top is from the cold root rat that exists out there. And so with the cold root rat, they use the launch agent of com.apple audio driver, right? And so the intent behind that was to actually blend in with a lot of the launch agents and launch daemons that exist on the macOS system. A lot of them start with com.apple if they are created by Apple. So if you're an attacker, you want to kind of hide in plain sight. So there's nothing preventing an attacker from creating a launch daemon that starts with com.apple. The second iteration here is from some malware that was distributed through a site called Mac Update. And so the Mac Update site is by itself pretty sketchy, but there's some legitimate stuff there. And so what they did was, it was a supply chain compromise, again, in which they were able to embed some malicious code into some of the applications hosted there. And with that, you see that launch control was used to launch, to load the macOS update.plist. And so that plist looks similar to what's here, but this is the plist for Little Snitch, which is a tool used for Mac for monitoring connections in and out. And so with that, once launch control is called and it's loaded into there, then from now on, when the system starts up, then it will call that executable, and that executable will run. And so when we start to look at launch agents and launch daemons in an environment, there's a few things that stick out that you could automatically count as malicious, right? And so this is a great example here from the cold root rat. And so you see the use of the com.apple, prefix, right? But you also see that the binary associated with it is unsigned, right? So that's a red flag, right? This code wasn't signed by any official entity. And so you can see the startup binary there, but if you take a deep look at the startup binary's location, you see that it's in temp, which is suspicious, right? Most of the time when an attacker gets onto the box, they might be restricted to where they could put specific files and binaries. Most of the time you'll find these binaries ending up in temp. And so from this now, knowing that we understand the tactic, which is persistence, and the technique, which is launch agents and launch daemons, then we could come up with a hypothesis. And so that hypothesis is an attacker has compromised at least one system and is persistent via a launch agent or a launch daemon. And so I mentioned before that OS Query is the best tool for doing this because it's the best at doing enterprise sweeps, which is good for persistent items. And so this is an example of a query that you might want to run at an interval. And so I'll walk through this query pretty quickly. And so there's the signature table S, right? And you would join that data on launch D, which includes launch agents and launch daemons. And so you want to grab the program arguments from the signature table where it's tied to launch D, and the name starts with com.apple, right? So that signifies a launch agent or a launch daemon that starts with com.apple. So that takes some things out of the picture. But then also you want to look for unsigned binary in the example that I showed right here, right? And so with that, the sign flag will be 0, right? And so with that, you'll be able to detect something like the code root rat. And then, as I mentioned before, it's important for it to run at load or else it doesn't really achieve persistence. And so that's all well and good, but when it comes to defense, you want to consider how robust is your detection for a particular thing. And so we might want to tweak that a little bit to say an attacker has compromised at least one system and maybe they're persisting via a signed launch agent or launch daemon in which the binary is not signed by Apple. And so there's nothing stopping someone from getting compromised, maybe like an Apple developer, and then the attacker using the Apple developer certificate to sign their malicious code, right? And so you want to account for this sort of thing. Also, the vetting process of actually someone signing up to be an Apple developer and getting a certificate, they could use that certificate to write malicious code. That vetting process of, is this person a sketchy person that might want to write code, malicious code, is not really well documented or vetted by Apple. And so what you have a lot of the times to bypass a certain mechanism, I'll talk about it later, called gatekeeper, you'll have signed malicious code out there in a while and it'll be able to execute because gatekeeper sees that it's signed, right? And so to take account for this, you would do the following. You would account for com.apple, but then the authority of not software signing, because software signing, it is associated with Apple signed binaries. And if anyone went to Josh Pitt's talk, he mentioned a way to kind of fool Apple's code signature process based on like certain tools out there, open source tools. And so a requirement for that specific technique is the use of the 86 I386 architecture for binaries, right? So you have to use that architecture in order for this type of attack to work. And so if you included that, you'll take into consideration Josh Pitt's technique that he introduced today. So that's from the persistence side. As far as privilege escalation goes, well, you can't do many things on a Mac unless you have some elevated privileges, right? There's something you just can't, right? So most times on a Mac system, the person who is the main user of the system doesn't create a second account. And so because they don't create the second account, they're automatically admin. So most times if you compromise the system, you're able to get the keychain and dump the password, well, then you're able to elevate your privileges, right? But that's not always the case. And so one common way to elevate privileges on a Mac is to give the user a prompt, whether it be through a systematic like API call or through something like AppleScript, right? And so this is a prompt that I created using AppleScript. And if you enter your username and password and you're the admin on the system, then it will execute as elevated process, or it will be spawned with elevated privileges. And so behind this is just like a simple LS, but it could be anything behind that, right? And so on the Mac systems all the time, you get a bunch of pop-ups and you're not really sure if they're legitimate or not legitimate, right? Apple does a bad job of actually showing that to the user because it happens so many times, but all it takes is one entry into this with username and password and it's game over. And so one hypothesis that we can create is, well, what if an attacker has compromised at least one system and has elevated their privileges through the use of the sudo command, right? So sudo command is similar to that of Linux. You get it, you can use it to elevate privileges. And so one thing that you want to look for in your environment is baselining how often sudo is being used, right? And so if you don't expect your users to sudo much, well, then this is something that will give you a lot of good fidelity. So it'll be high fidelity, but it'll be like not that many alerts that come to you, right? And so also, when folks are invoking the prompt for elevated privileges through like an API call, it calls this security off trampoline binary. And so you want to baseline the use of that in your environment as well. Those two things shouldn't happen very often at all in your environment. And if it does, then it's probably tied back to some legitimate tool, whether it be, I've seen Microsoft suite of tools like Microsoft Office. I've seen tools like Little Snitch, but these are legitimate tools, which if you check the code signature on them, they're tied back to like some legitimate entity, right? And so the next tactic that I'll get into is defense evasion. And so in order to talk about defense evasion, you have to talk about, well, what are the different defense mechanisms on macOS systems? Well, the first is file quarantine, right? So the idea behind file quarantine is to slow the user down from executing things that were downloaded from the internet. And so let's say you download something from the internet. Here I downloaded Opera, the browser, and its installer, and it asks me, do I want to open this? It came from the internet, and it shows me the URL. But one thing about this is that it doesn't prevent the user from opening this. It just shows the user that, hey, like you might want to slow down and think about what you're doing here. So Gatekeeper is complementary, where once you say, okay, I want to open this, Gatekeeper checks to see if it's signed by a legitimate entity, right? So that's like an Apple developer, that's like Apple itself. And if it's not, let's say that that binary is unsigned, or the binary is signed by already identified malicious entity, well, it asks you, are you sure you want to open this? This came from an unidentified developer or a malicious developer, right? And so it doesn't, again, stop you from opening it. It just tries to slow you down from doing something pretty dumb, right? And so to combat that, you have XProtect, which a lot of people don't know about, which is basically the built-in AV system for macOS systems, right? And so the idea behind XProtect, it used to be like just like SHA-256 hashes that were stored on the system, but they've since moved to Yara-based signatures. And so the Yara signatures are open to anyone to go see. So if you go to the system library, core services, XProtect bundle, and the resources, you can see all of the Yara rules that Apple is actually using to detect the malware, right? And so with that, malware authors can also see the same thing. So they can modify their malware to kind of evade XProtect. And then you have system integrity protection. And so the idea behind that is like Apple wants macOS systems to be rootless. So let's say that even if you were root on a Mac system, there's only so much you can do as far as to compromise a system to like smithereens, right? You can't totally compromise the Mac. There are some folders and files that are protected, even if you're the root user, and that's by design, right? So there's a way to disable system integrity protection, but you have to have physical access to the system, or there's been vulnerabilities that have popped up over the last 2 years where people have been able to circumvent system integrity protection, and it has to do with like malicious, like dynamic libraries and things of that sort. So one way to bypass Gatekeeper that's pretty significant is that in order for file quarantine or Gatekeeper to notify you that something originated from the internet, what it does something similar to Windows, where it does like a mark of the web, and that's called an extended attribute. So it'll tie the extended attribute to the file that was downloaded and say, hey, this thing was downloaded from the internet. Well, there are some applications on macOS which are not quarantine aware, right? And so one of those applications is Terminal. So if you could simply get a user to run a command that goes to download something, well, then it's not quarantine aware. Gatekeeper doesn't know about it, file quarantine doesn't know about it, and it'll allow it to run. It'll bypass the code check. It'll bypass, hey, did you originate from the internet? And so this instance was from some crypto malware that was targeting a certain community, and it was presented by SANS ISC, right? The Storm Center. And so in this instance, they went to go curl a binary from the internet, and with that, it changed the permissions on that and then allowed the script to execute. And so another way to bypass gatekeeper is to simply just delete the quarantine flag that's associated with it. So the extended attribute, which is com.apple.quarantine, you could just delete it and it'll allow it to run, right? And so one hypothesis that we want to create is, well, an attacker has attempted to, they have compromised at least one system and is attempting to evade defenses, specifically system integrity protection and or gatekeeper. And so with this, for OS query, which is great at point in time, you can check to see if for any of your users, the system integrity check is like disabled, right? So if enabled is equal to 0, which means it's disabled, you might want to know about that, right? Because that's unusual. And then for real-time process monitoring, you might want to look at baselining the use of like curl, get, wget for attempts to download files, specifically for like IP addresses. You might want to monitor for the use of the system control command to disable gatekeeper. And then you might also want to monitor for the use of xadder to remove the extended attribute that I just showed. And so I'll get into the demo portion of the presentation in which it'll outline like an attack that happens on the Mac side, and then it'll show you how to go about hunting for that using some other tools I introduced. So this is common. A user gets an email like this saying that, hey, you must download this file. Mojave is coming up to upgrade. These are network settings that need to be updated on the system in order for you to connect to the corporate network. So we want you to download this Apple script, and then we want you to execute this command, right? And so a hypothesis that could be generated from that, from a hunter point of view, is that an attacker has compromised at least one system and is executing malicious code via Apple script. And so how might this look from a hunting perspective, right? What data might we need and what platforms would we use? And so with this, you have OS query and xnumon running on a box, right? And it's collecting those logs, collecting that information that you need, and then that's being fed into Helk. Helk is a tool written by Roberto Rodriguez, a colleague of mine at Spectre Ops, which is used for kind of modeling all of your data into one location. So it's SIM-based, but then also doing some additional data science on top of that to get the most out of your data, right? And so then from the attacker's perspective, they could use a tool like Empire, which is a remote access Trojan that could be used for Windows, Mac, and Linux, right? So I'll be using that to carry out my attack in the demo. All right, let's get to the demo. All right, might be a little hard to see this, but we'll walk through it. So this is the attacker activity. So the person has entered in that command just now. They've downloaded the file. And so from an attacker point of view, in Empire, that agent has come up. And so what they're going to do now with that agent, they're on the system with that agent. They're able to take that agent and run a collection module, which will prompt any application on the system, and tell the user that the password is required in order for the application to run, right? And so in this case, I used the App Store application, and so we'll get to see that here in a moment. So I'm setting up the agent and making sure that that's all good to go, and then once it executes, it'll switch over to the end user's end side. All right, so from the end user's perspective now, you see that the App Store came up and then asks you for your password to continue. And so this looks like any normal prompt that you would see on your Mac OS system at any point in time, right? Your users will be fooled by this. And so they entered in their password. And on the Empire side, we see that it gave us some results. And so with that agent now, we could go into the directory that the agent is designated to, and we could see the logs for that particular agent. And embedded in those logs would be the password that was returned by the user. And so we'll get to see that here in a second, and then we could actually use that password to elevate our privileges on the system, because of course this person hasn't separated the admin account from like a normal user account on their box, right? And so it's using the module here to spawn another agent using the credentials that were specified in that agent output. And so here you see I've supplied the password of Apple123, which is what the user entered. And then once that's executed on the box, it'll give us that privilege escalation. You see that's returned to us. A new agent has been kicked off, specified by the green there. And so with that agent now, we can do suspicious, well, more malicious things on the system, such as create a launch daemon. So an important thing to note here is that from the detections that I've introduced so far for OS query, that's been added to the OS query configuration. And so you'll get to see on the analyst side when we hunt for this is a possibility that that analytic might trigger. And so here you see I named the launch agent, well, the launch daemon, com.apple.network update. And so that's to blend in with all this system activity that happens on a Mac. So if you're not familiar with that as a hunter, then you might come across that and think it might be, you know, legitimate, right? So this is the analyst hunt side now. And so as part of the analyst hunt, we're hunting for Apple script being used in the environment. So we start our search with OSA script to see how often it's used, if it's used at all in the environment. And so we see that it's been used 62 times, right? And so as it's been used 62 times, we want to see, well, when was the OSA script binary actually executed? How many times did that occur? And you see it's only been a handful of times, right? And so the first iteration of that is when that command that was run by the user to kick off the malicious activity occurred, right? And so we don't know that as a hunter, but we'll get to the next iteration here where OSA script was used to actually prompt the App Store to run, and then the results of that was going to be entered into a file, right? And so that looks suspicious because you see it was like, it's asking for password. So we also see that the child of that using ancestors was Python. So Python spawned OSA script, Apple script, and so that is suspicious, right? So we want to look for, well, how often is Python run in their environment? And so with that, we get some results back, and we're like, okay, there's quite a few Python instances here. And with that, we see some base 64 encoding with Python. It was like, well, I mean, unless our developers are doing that, that looks like a bad day, right? And so we could take that and we can decode that base 64 using a tool like CyberChef. And we'll see here what the output of the CyberChef results will be. And so you see that there's an IP in there, and you see get.php. Well, that looks pretty suspicious, right? That's enough probably to kick off incident response process, especially if that IP address is not internal, right? It's internal for the use of this demo here, but if that was to be an external IP or external domain, you might have some interest in that. And so we could see here that because of our analytic that we had from our hunt before, we were able to detect the launch daemon, right? So we detected the launch daemon of com.apple.network update. And so that's a win for us, right? So right now, we've definitely kicked off the IR process, and we know that an adversary is living within our environment. And so another thing that we might be curious about, well, so here you see that it's run at load. Run at load is set to 1, so it's going to persist on the system, and it's going to load whenever the system reboots or starts, right? And so one thing that we might be really interested in is, well, how did they actually elevate their privileges in order to install the launch daemon, right? And so with that, we could go in and we could see how many times have sudo been listed as like an argument, right, in the process execution. And so with that, you'll see that here. And so in Splunk, this is easy. Like you could do like stats count by, and like Elasticsearch is a bit tougher. So I'm going through the process of how to actually do that. And so you see that sudo was at least mentioned 65 times. And so we can filter for that. And then we want to see, well, within sudo, what arguments were passed to the command line when sudo was called, right? And so that would be significant to us. We want to see like at what point was sudo used for malicious activity. And so we see that bin shell was used 2 times as opposed to like bash, right? So that's significant enough. We might be a little bit interested in that. And so in the instances where the shell was used, well, what command line arguments were present? And so you see sudo and Python in the same line, right? And so that's pretty suspicious. And so we want to look for instances where sudo and Python were used at the same time. And so we get 4 hits back, but as you scroll down, you see evidence of Apple 1, 2, 3. And so at this point, you're like, okay, we know how they elevated their privileges. We know that they installed a launch daemon, and we could probably tie it back to the file that was downloaded to the system. And so that's just an example of how you would do hunting for Mac OS. All right, and so some of the credits here that are used for my talk is obviously Jonathan Levin's Security and Insecurity book. If you don't have that book, volume 3, it goes into a lot of the details about Mac OS internals, especially from the security aspect. It covers iOS as well. You might want to pick up that book. And then of course, Objective-C. I'll be presenting this talk in a different iteration at the Objective by the Sea talk is in Hawaii in November. That's hosted by Patrick Wardle, if you're familiar with him. He does a lot of Mac OS research. I've also used the stuff from the Internet Storm Center, as well as Apple, and Hacker News had an interesting article about some of the macro malware that was used for this presentation. And if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at Cyrus, and that's the end of my talk. Thanks. I'll open it up to any questions. You could just yell it out. So one thing that I didn't talk about as far as so he asks, what would you recommend as far as getting logs off of an endpoint for Mac OS? One thing that I didn't mention that was used in the demo is FileBeat. So FileBeat was used to actually ship those logs from like var log OS query and var log xnumon to ingest into Helk. So, yep. Another question back here. The slides will be posted on my blog, and I'll put it out on Twitter as well. SecurityNeverSleeps.net. Yep. Any other questions?
Hey, Richie, would you look at some of the process masquerade, like reading some like python.com.apple.net.tick? Are there any specific pieces of metadata that you could use to identify like some process manipulation or process secret network for defensive agents?
Yeah, so the xnumon tool, right, oh, I'm repeating the question. So Devin asked about the network piece of it. So if someone was to evade defenses and they were to use network, right, how would you go about detecting that? Well, there's no open source tools that do that pretty well today, right? You have to use AutoD for Mac, which is pretty like hard to use, but it does give you network information about processes that make network connections. xnumon, the guy Daniel Roethlisberger, is planning to add like network use of, process use of network activity in future iterations of that tool. So that's one way you detect it. But outside of that, you would use something like AutoD. Yeah, I've seen Java Rat being used pretty heavily in a while. So the question was, have I seen like Adwin, like Java Rats being used in a while? That's pretty prevalent on Mac OS systems, and most people don't have Java installed on their Mac anyway. So if you do, then you would target those users and you would start to baseline some of that Java activity. Yeah, especially network connections going out. So you would tie in the endpoint data with your network data to make that correlation. I'll take 2 more questions.
Do you know of any good tools that kind of list rules that directly correlate with MITRE ATTACK? Like I know like Sysmod sometimes says like, oh, well, these rules kind of correlate with MITRE.
So for Mac, that doesn't exist yet, but there's been a lot of discussion about that same thing, where tools will start to display, you know, the technique ID that they correspond to, right? Like a specific technique, right? So someone will like OS Query to say, hey, we cover these technique IDs, right? That might be something that comes along like down in the pipeline. So.
What tools do you recommend for managing OS Query kind of enterprise? I know there's some out there, but
So the question was, what tools do you suggest for kind of managing your OS Query instance, things of that sort? And so with that, I would consider Collide, which is a parent company of like OS Query. And so with Collide, you're able to basically take a query and select what host you want to run that query against. And you could do a lot of the configuration at that like central management terminal for Collide. So that's one tool that I would recommend strongly. All right, thank you.